So I have a friend, and her academic area of interest is faith and sexuality. And as some of you know, my academic area of interest is faith and money. And we have long joked that we can go to any dinner party and instantly make everyone uncomfortable. Sex and money are things that are hard to talk about, and particularly hear about from the pulpit. As part of my research several years ago, I surveyed people about the idea of hearing about money from the pulpit, and the response was virtually zero. The only thing that polled worse than that was offering a class about faith and money, which I did here at Trinity a couple of years ago, and I see a few of the brave souls who attended that, but needless to say, it was not our most popular offering that season. Money is a hard thing to talk about. Our former presiding bishop, Cathedral Jeffrey Shores, used to say it was the third rail of the church. And yet, we are well aware that money is what funds the mission and the ministry that we do here. This past week, or maybe not yet, many of you received a letter from me describing our pledge campaign for this year and asking you to renew your pledge and, moreover, to increase it. And I understand if it was a letter that made you a little uncomfortable, kind of a little queasy in the gut. It certainly does when I think of those and get those letters. But I know what those funds are needed for here at Trinity. I understand it's part of our transition as we move to a new missional and financial model, and it still doesn't make it that easy. It's an uncomfortable place to be. And yet our former Archbishop of Canterbury pointed out that there is no better example of practical theology than a church budget. It's where the rubber hits the road. It's where we really see what are our true priorities in the way that we spend money. How much do we spend on children and youth programming when we talk about that as a priority? How is our budget a manifestation of our faith? I know all of this makes many of us very, very uncomfortable. But I invite you to lean into that discomfort. In a way, it's sort of a vulnerability. There's certainly loads of judgment that goes on when we think about money and pledging and giving and all the rest. And I invite us today not to push that aside, but to lean into that. And I think that is the primary message that Jesus is trying to convey to us in the gospel today in this parable, is to lean in to the unease, the uncertainty, to lean into the vulnerability, the ambiguity that is life. The theologian Richard Rohr famously points out that so much of our world is based on a binary, yes, no, black, white, clear, distinct answers. It gives us the illusion that we have some kind of control over the world. But in fact, we know that's not the case. The world and God's creation always surprises us in new and innovative and sometimes terrorizing ways. We're called to live into that ambiguity. That's Jesus' primary criticism of the Pharisee today. He is so self-confident, self-satisfied, he doesn't really question much of anything. Doesn't make himself vulnerable in the least bit. When Jesus told this parable, I'm sure it was shocking to his audience. For those of us who've listened to Jesus for a while, we know the Pharisees usually don't come off very well. But at Jesus' time, the Pharisees, they were the progressive, reform-minded lay leaders. They were encouraging Judaism to switch from a focus on the sacrifice of animals to a focus on prayer. And after the fall of the Second Temple in the year 70 in Jerusalem and the beginning of the Jewish diaspora, those Pharisees will be the ones who dominate the theological conversation. Their emphasis on prayer will make its way into our tradition as well as the Islamic tradition. We have much to thank them for, and in their time they were regarded incredibly well. So when Jesus calls the Pharisee to question, he's challenging his audience in the way that his parables always do. Remember, Jesus' parables were meant to challenge the values of his time and ours. Myths are stories that we tell ourselves that reinforce those values, but parables, those are the ones that challenge them. And Jesus does this today, both in the way he describes the Pharisee, but also in his treatment of the tax collector. Tax collectors were universally reviled, and for good reason. They were viewed as traitors. They worked for the Roman Empire. And they made their money off of swindling people. The way the Roman tax authority worked was that a tax collector had a fixed quota that they were to deliver to the Roman government, and anything beyond that they got to keep. So people knew that tax collectors had a vested interest in cheating them, and so they were reviled. And so the mere fact that the tax collector shows up in the temple at all is remarkable in this parable. When the tax collector shows up, he's off in the corner because he's afraid. He could suffer physical attack, certainly verbal attack. And it wasn't the Pharisee that was the only one there saying, "What's that tax collector doing?" He knows he's being judged by those around him. But he steps into that vulnerability and a belief that despite his brokenness, he is still a child of God. That despite the ambiguity and uncertainty, he will lean into that vulnerability. That's the sharp contrast between him and the Pharisee. What the Pharisee does are all admirable things. He prays, he fasts, he tithes, but he doesn't question, at least in that moment. He doesn't lean into the vulnerability or ambiguity. He doesn't subject himself to that at all. And Jesus recognizes that without that vulnerability, he will never grow. Because it's in that vulnerability that we grow in love. When we think about any loving relationship, vulnerability is a key component to it. Without that vulnerability, none of us grow in our love for another person or for God. And so Jesus is encouraging us in that vulnerability. And for me, one of the ways to exercise that vulnerability muscle has been through giving. Financial giving is a small way of making myself vulnerable so that I'm more prepared when the big things come. It's never easy to make ourselves vulnerable, and we live in a culture that tries to make ourselves as little vulnerability as possible. So finding ways that we can grow into that vulnerability is part of a practice of spiritual growth, one that Jesus is encouraging today. That vulnerability also is paired with persistence. Last Sunday, Sharisa gave us a beautiful sermon around persistence. You may remember the widow, the persistent widow. That widow was someone who made herself vulnerable every time she went before that judge. I'm sure the judge discarded her, and many people told her she was being foolish or naive to even try, but she persists in her vulnerability, and she prevails. It takes courage to be vulnerable. It's not work that we need to do alone, but together we are called to lean into that vulnerability in the same way that St. Paul did. Paul went all around the Mediterranean world teaching about Jesus and the gospel, and along the way he got run out of towns, arrested, tried, imprisoned, made himself incredibly vulnerable, and he continued. He persisted. And when he writes to Timothy today, he doesn't say that he's won the race. He says that he has run the race. He's lived into his faith and vulnerability. Paul is arguably the most important evangelism of all Christianity, and yet he doesn't discuss that. He doesn't talk about his accomplishments. He highlights his persistence, his persistent vulnerability. We see that in Paul. We see that in the widow that we heard about last week. We see that in our parable. And we see it in a particularly unique way in our very first reading from Jeremiah. Jeremiah wrote at a very interesting time in Israel's history. Israel had lost to the Babylonians, lost to the Assyrians, and their town was destroyed. The defensive walls were gone, and it was the beginning of the Babylonian exile, where about half of the population was enslaved up in Babylon to build their kingdom. When we read the book of Isaiah, we hear about the return of the Babylonian exiles and the subsequent reconciliation. But Jeremiah did not live to see that. Jeremiah dies about 30 years into the Babylonian exile. So all that Jeremiah sees is the fear, the despair, the tragedy, the literal vulnerability because all the defensive walls are gone. And yet despite that, despite the mistakes, they lean into their faith. Every chapter of Jeremiah, you get this same piece. Underlying all of it is a persistence in faith, even when it doesn't seem to make much sense. They make themselves vulnerable to those who would call them foolish or naive for continuing to believe. But they live into that vulnerability. They persist even when all seems lost. So as we live in times of fear and despair, they give us a model of how to live as a community, vulnerably, persistently, lovingly. Because if we really think about the essence of love, it is vulnerability and persistence, those two together. Those are the foundations of the love that Jesus taught us and that we carry towards one another. Vulnerability and persistence is why we gather week after week. It's because when we do this work together, we can bring the joy and hope of the gospel into the world. Together, we can confront the vulnerability of our times and find the strength together that allows us to put fear and despair at bay. Stand together in that love that Jesus shared. It's when we build those relationships that we can change the world. Living into vulnerability is not easy, nor is it anything we're called to do alone. But together, with that persistent vulnerability, we can be the people of God. Now, I know this has been a bit of a heavy subject, so of course I'm going to end with a limerick. Asking for money is never great. In fact, it's the part of this job that I hate. But it's that time of year, so let me be clear. Please fill out those pledge cards. Don't wait. Amen.